Some of you know that we had a funeral here yesterday for one of the pillars of the church. It was a glorious celebration of a life well lived. Now, what you may and may not know is I've been in this area for so long that I'm friends with just about everybody who works at any funeral home in Clarksville. And so one of the folks who was here from McReynolds Nave Larson had peeked at our bulletin for today and saw that the sermon title was, "How Do I Know God's Will?" And he asked me, "Harriet, are you in the middle of a series?" And I was like, "No, it's one sermon." And he looked at me and he said, "This isn't a series, you're one sermon about how you discern God's will." And I said, "Oh, you just don't know how smart the people of Madison Street are. One sermon's all it takes." It made me think of the story that some of you may remember of the little girl who was drawing a picture, and she was just so intent on her drawing that when her mother called her to supper, she didn't show up. And so Mom sent Dad to go get her so the meal didn't get cold. Dad went and found her and he said, asked her, "Didn't you hear your mother calling you?" And she said, yes, I just want to finish this drawing." And he asked her, "Well, honey, what are you drawing?" And she said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And he said, "Sweetheart, nobody knows what God looks like." And she said, "Well, they will when I'm finished." So, when I am finished, and guess what? Today's sermon has 15 points. So make yourselves comfortable. Really, it's going to go fast, I promise. But I have always loved this story of Solomon asking God for wisdom, when Solomon could have asked God for anything. Now, growing up, I had a Bible. My sister and I had a Bible in our bedroom that we shared that makes this Bible look really small. It was one of those great big picture books, and it had all sorts of fun color illustrations in it. Not one of the small little illustrated ones, but, big. And the story that follows the story that Pastor Tim read is of a display of Solomon's wisdom. Some of you may remember this story from long ago, but this picture book that I had it all drawn out. I can still see it in my mind's eye. That two women came to Solomon seeking justice. They'd been sharing a room together. They had given birth within 3 days of each other, and one of the babies had died. And in the middle of the night, one of the women claimed that the woman whose baby had died came and stole her baby, and so that was still alive. And so both were claiming the child. And they asked Solomon to decide who was the mother of this child. And Solomon listened, and then he called for a sword to be brought to him. And he said, "The way that I know to make this decision is I'm going to take this sword and I'm going to slice this baby in two. And one mother gets half and the other mother gets half. And that way each of you will have a part of this child." Well, one of the women immediately cried out, No. King Solomon, please let the other woman have the baby." And he said, "That is the mother of the child, because she wants the child to live." Whereas the other woman had already lost a child, and she was like, "Well, I can't have one, she shouldn't have one either." And Solomon was right, and everybody marveled at how wise King Solomon was. So how do we become wise? How do we make decisions that are in alignment with God's will for our lives? That's really the question. As those who have been baptized, we know that our purpose in life is to serve God and to make God visible in the world. But how do we go about doing that? I've always been drawn to the work of St. Ignatius when it comes to making decisions. And some of you have asked me for advice, and I have been known to boil this down to 3 questions instead of 15 points. But here goes with a story about St. Ignatius. Now, St. Ignatius lived in the latter part of the 1400s and the early 1500s. He began life as a soldier, and during the invasion, he was present at an attack at a castle, he had a cannonball go through his legs and shatter his legs. Been reset. Didn't look good to him. He wasn't going to look good in those courtly tights that men wore in those days. So he asked them to re-break his leg and set it so it would look better and women would find him more attractive. He's lying in his bed convalescing, and he asked for romance novels to be brought to him to pass the time because he's got a lot of time on his hands. Well, the castle where he was convalescing did not have a single romance novel, but they had a copy of the Life of Christ and a copy of the Life of Saints. And they said, "Here you go, Ignatius. Here is your reading material." And so he began to read these books, and he was bored. So he supplemented his reading with an active fantasy life, imagining himself as the dashing warrior once again, serving some unidentified courtly lady and having great exploits. And he also spent his time, after reading these books, fantasizing about what it would be like to commit his life to God, to turn everything over and to serve God and to become a monk. And over the course of time, he realized that after his daydreams of glamour and valor, he was excited as he dreamt, as he fantasized, and then he always felt sort of flat and depressed. But when he fantasized about serving God, after he did so, he noticed that he was filled with joy and hope. And over time, he came to this realization, this belief, that God speaks to us in our interior mind, heart, and thoughts, that God desires to give us wisdom. James 1:5 says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, ask God, and God will give it to you." And so Ignatius developed some guidelines. Now, he was not naive enough to believe that every thought that we have comes from God. He recognized that there is what he calls the enemy of human nature that would lead us astray, which is why discernment and asking God for wisdom is so very important. There are three observations that Ignatius made about discernment. And the first is discernment is always choosing between two goods. It's never a choice between something that is good and something that is bad. So if we are trying to decide whether to cheat on a test or cheat on a spouse, that's not a question for discernment. Just don't do the thing that you know that you shouldn't do. That was Ignatius's point. But the second point is that discernment only makes sense when we have a personal relationship with God. When we love somebody, we want to do something that will please them. And if we love God and that's our heart's desire, then God is going to honor our request for wisdom and for discernment. And then the third observation that Ignatius made about discernment is that it is often a struggle. It can be difficult. Again, there's that enemy of human nature. We have our false self, we have pride, we have our egos, we have our inability to trust, our desire to hold on to control. There are all sorts of things that make it difficult for us really to say to God, "Please guide me. I will do what you want for me to do." And so Ignatius also observed that there are three types of people. There are those who are all talk and no action. They say that they're going to do what God wants them to do, that that's who they want to be, but they are just so consumed with busyness, they never get around to taking the time that they need to listen to God speak to them. Then secondly, Ignatius observed that there are conditional Christians. And those are the ones who put conditions on what God can do. God, I need to choose a career, and I will do whatever you want me to do as long as it keeps me in an upper middle class lifestyle. You get the picture. So for those who want to say, I am yours if you meet my conditions that I've already come up with. And thirdly, Ignatius said, there's the person who's willing to completely surrender one's life to God and say, you created me, my life has purpose, and I will follow whatever it is that you want me to do, God. Makes me think of John Wesley's covenant prayer, written some couple of hundred years later. It's a prayer that this many years in ministry, I have to tell you, friends, I still have a hard time praying sometimes because it starts off with, God, I am no longer my own but thine. Do with me what thou wilt. Let me be employed by thee or laid aside by thee. Put me to suffering, put me to doing. I mean, it just says, I surrender all. And it is a difficult prayer to mean in every aspect of our lives every day. I just want to acknowledge that. So if you think that I have it all together, well, like all of us, I am a work in progress. And guess what? Just like that, we've made it through 6 points of the sermon. See? It's not as bad as y'all thought it was going to be. So now, there are 5 basic attitudes that help us hear God speak. The first is an openness to hearing God speak. Now, I know that sounds obvious, and we've already touched on this, but there are those of us who are tempted to think, well, I've already made up my mind. So don't confuse me with the facts. Perhaps some of our students have already gone through this and decided where they're going to school, but God, it might sound like this. God, I will go wherever you want me to go to college as long as it is within an hour's drive of my parents' house or 4 hours or whatever. But, don't confuse me with the facts. I know. No, we need the first prerequisite for hearing from God is to be open. The second is oh so similar, but it is a generosity of spirit. It is, in effect, giving God a blank check and saying, my life is yours. Do with it what you will. Direct me, because it is only in you, O God, that I know that I will find the abundant life for which you created me. This leads us to our third attitude or quality, and that's courage. Friends, it is risky. It takes a lot of courage, really, to surrender our lives to God. Some of you know that I recently got a new car because of the hailstorm on May 8th, and the insurance company determined that my car had been totaled. And I really went back and forth. I ended up with the car that I have, but they had a 5-speed that I wanted. I've always driven a manual, a stick shift, and my husband persuaded me to get the automatic because of the resale value. I did ask him for advice, but it made me think that one of my friends had observed, probably pretty astutely some years ago, Harriet, the reason that you like to drive a stick shift so much is because you like being in control. I think that's probably true. So it takes a lot of courage to say, God, I am yours. Do with me what thou wilt. And all of this only really happens and makes sense when we can be open, we can be generous with our lives, have the attitude with God. We can ask God to give us courage. But if we habitually listen to God, if we have a time where we listen to God's guidance and seek God's guidance on a regular basis, it becomes easier and easier to discern where God is calling us and what God is calling us to do. And then all of this is built upon this idea of putting God first, of beginning with the end in mind, keeping God as the most important factor in making any decisions. What this looks like when we confuse the ends with the means is that maybe we value success or popularity or power or money over anything else. And then after we achieve our goals of success, we're like, well, okay, now I'm going to be able to make charitable donations. That will please God. Now I'm going to be able to volunteer my time. That will please God. Those things are true, but what God asks of us is to put God first and then let everything else fall into place. Wow, just like that. 6 + 6, 5, 11. Friends, we only have 4 more to go. Now, this is the meat of the sermon. These are the 4 discernment techniques that we can use when we are faced with a decision that we are trying to make. And the first one, Ignatius recommends, is that we consider what advice we would give to a stranger. Because all too often, we're better at giving advice to others than we are following it ourselves. I have sometimes heard that we might consider what advice would we give a best friend, what advice would we give to a loved one, but whatever it is, the first technique is to consider if someone else were in this situation and trying to make up their mind, what advice would I give? The second one is, according to Ignatius, is to picture ourselves either on our deathbed or we've just drawn our last breath and we're standing before Christ our judge and we're considering, well, what does Christ think? What does Jesus think about the decision that I just made? Now, I have to tell you, I was a little surprised when I read that was Ignatius's exact advice, because I've always heard a softened approach to that, which is, look back over your life and think what you're going to regret or what you're going to celebrate. Maybe do it 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But man, Ignatius just cut to the quick and said, you're standing before Christ your judge. How are you going to answer? So that is the second technique that Ignatius recommended. And then the third, if you don't have clarity, is Ignatius said, now is the time to use your reason and weigh the pros and cons. Don't begin with that because that muddies everything. But if you still lack clarity, weigh the pros and cons and pray over that. Again, that's that habitual practice of prayer. And then fourthly, Ignatius advised that after you think you've made your decision, ask God for confirmation that you have made the right decision. And generally speaking, the right decision is accompanied by a feeling of rightness, of peace and joy and relief. There may be some anxiety because, again, it can be risky to follow God's leading, but if the decision is not the one that God would have us make, then we typically have feelings of heaviness and sadness and despair, and God is not asking us to go in that direction. You've been very patient in listening to all of this, and so now that you have, let me tell you, I've distilled this sermon into a series of 2 questions that you can find in your bulletin. I think maybe there are 4 questions, but 2 sets of questions based upon this interior monologue that we have with God that Ignatius referred to as consolation and desolation, but the decision that I'm making, is it moving me to a place of peace, joy, and fulfillment, putting God first, or is it leading me to a place of emptiness and despair? Those original feelings that Ignatius had when he was fantasizing about his future. Friends, I begin every single day with a simple prayer. I pray more than this, but my first prayer of the day is always from James chapter 1, verse 5. God, grant me wisdom that is greater than my own, because I know that I need it. Friends, that is a prayer. I'm not saying that I haven't made mistakes, because goodness knows I have. We all have. But I tell you from personal experience, that is a prayer that God honors. When we ask God for wisdom, God answers. And may God make all of us wiser than we are. Amen.